As our emancipatory discourses have become shaped by new forms of online media and digital mediation, it seems like it's the capitalism of the platform which holds all the cards. In the social media age, the forces of clickbait, billionaire dark money from the Koch brothers and Peter Thiel, and algorithmic biases have all combined together to push reaction through our screens and into our streams. Where neoliberalism failed to deliver the liberatory promise of feminism through work, conservatism now seeks a reversal of the gains of liberatory forces, particularly those of the sexual revolution. In response, those who believe in liberation must rally to fight back against reaction, first and foremost by understanding where this backlash is coming from and how to strategize to fight and counter it. This is the project of Collapse Feminism, the online fight for feminism's future, the debut book by video essayist Alice Cappelle, which will be out this November 14th on Repeater Books. I'm very lucky to have Alice joining me today to talk about the future of feminism in the online sphere. Alice, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
So, first and foremost, why collapse feminism? I know a lot of things are collapsing, but I want to see how that feeds into the overall arc.
No. To be fair, what I wanted to do with the book initially is a sort of assessment of how people forge their identities and opinions, but I was more interested in identities online, especially young people, and I wanted to look at it through a gender lens, so focusing on women and maybe men as well. At the beginning, I really wanted to focus on women. And then things happened in my country, in France. So what happened is that we had a lot of protests with the pension reform. And so I felt like I needed to add more of a political voice to this book, to add new layers. And so that's why I started to get interested in, how can I make it more, how can I make it more political? And that's around the time where I discovered this entire field of research called collapsology, which became super duper popular in France. And I found it interesting because the whole premise of this new field of research is that society is going to collapse at some point and we need to be prepared for it. And so I looked at all the data and I saw that, in fact, a lot of people do believe that society, civilization as we know it, is going to collapse in the near future. So I wondered, how does it impact our discourses, online discourses in particular? How does it impact the formation of the self? How do people forge their identities, forge their opinions based on that sort of framework, I guess, the collapse framework?
Of course, with the ongoing aspect of what we now call doomerism, collapse feels almost imminent, but that's because it's constantly being bombarded upon us. And I think there's definitely a sense in which people tend to think about identity so much negatively because they let the online discourse set the bounds of it. But they always look at identities as if they're always already sort of fully formed. The trad wife, the doomer, the it girl, and doesn't actually look at the ways in which these things are cultivated and produced and where they came from. And I think that's one of the real strengths of this book particularly. I mean, we've already gone through sort of the collapse part, but I want to sort of angle more towards the feminist aspect of this, because one of the central aspects of feminist analysis, which you highlight, sort of put forward as the core of it, is the centralizing of a notion of care. Essentially, the core principle of feminism is care around as a principle of social relations and sort of societal organization. And I just want to ask, how do you think capitalism has appropriated this idea of care? Because I think one of the main sort of strengths of the book is how it goes through these existent feminisms and indeed non-revolutionary and arguably it might be struggle to call them feminisms, but reactionary feminisms, and how they can be recuperated, but without getting rid of the real core of it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And maybe to start answering this question, it would be interesting also to kind of contextualize this notion in feminist spheres. When you look at it, when you look back on history, you see that this notion of care has been appropriated by feminists to kind of push for women's rights. So, for example, back in the 19th century, 20th century, when American women in particular wanted to gain greater rights, wanted to gain access to voting, wanted to be able to vote, they used this notion of care. They used this notion of women are caring essentially good and essentially caring individuals, and therefore we need the right to vote because we have those values that men don't have. So it's interesting to keep that in mind as we talk about care, because like even today when feminists talk about care, sometimes like it's in the kind of reminiscent of that culture, this idea that women are essentially good, they will care, that's why you need more women in government, more women at leadership positions, which is not exactly what we mean by care, well, at least what I mean by care. So yeah, that's, I guess, one aspect that to keep in mind. And I guess it connects to the way neoliberalism has also appropriated this notion. So in the book, I talk about my president, President Macron, who used this notion during COVID, for example, saying that his priority is care for everybody, women, men, children. But at the same time, like he was kind of destroying our NHS system, let's say, because we also have like a very public funded type of system that is getting more and more privatized, same as the NHS. So that was really interesting how this notion kind of got recuperated by neoliberals, and even within the feminist movement, where you have, again, this sort of we care, but what do we really mean by care? It's not just an attitude of like being positive and being nice and I don't know what else could be associated with it, but that's why I wanted to explore that in this book, and especially given the rise of conservatism. We talked about trad wives or all those things, how they will use that notion to then push for more and more conservative ideas. So there really is a pipeline there. You see, like it's all connected, and that's why we need to be very, very clear about what we mean when we talk about care. And I guess we'll talk about that later. But yeah.
No, absolutely. The essentializing of care. I mean, you talk about this very much in your analysis of these online subcultures of the divine, there's like the divine feminine or the essential archetypal feminine. And it's an interesting through line really in this transformation of how we think about care, moving from this archetypal mythological way of thinking about it towards thinking about less about care as an essential quality, but more as a function, more as something that you do. And this seems very much in the history of feminism to track with the arrival on the scene of particular Marxist, very Leninist kind of feminism. So I'm thinking of people, like Silvia Federici and Selma James, the wages for housework movement. And this leads into the idea that one can liberate or at least put the caring, or at least the relationships of gendered labor on the path to liberation through recognizing them explicitly as forms of labor, and therefore aligning the struggle for labor or for product liberation from the relations of production with what would go on to be called, of course, social reproduction. And this is so central to the thesis of the book, of course, because it's also about the failure of this dream of simply of basically associating feminism with a labor struggle insofar as it transforms all care into work. Not in the sense that the wages for housework movement failed on its own terms, but rather that there was something from the outside, from the enemy's side, so to speak, overcoding, recoding it, and into the figure of liberatory labor itself being liberatory, rather than it being a revelation of what could liberate us in the future. And for this, I wanted to ask a little bit about the way you tackle particularly the figure of the girl boss, the notorious figure of the girl boss, and how this is a product really of this historical process of recuperating sort of the liberatory power of making labor relations explicit in the household.
Again, it's another tricky situation, you see, because like the sort of image of the girl boss emerged at the same time as neoliberalism started to grow. So we're talking about the 70s, 80s, and it was a time where feminists really pushed across the political spectrum, really pushed for, except conservatives, but really pushed for, promoting and encouraging women to join the workforce. And it worked really, really well, because like when you look at statistics of who gets bachelor's degrees, women, they get more and more bachelor's degrees, sometimes even more than men. I mean, Richard Reeves, I think it was, no, was it Reeves? I can't remember, of Boys and Men, who recently wrote this book that then was adapted in videos on YouTube that circulated a lot. That was a core thesis. You know, it's like, oh, gender equality has been reversed now because women get more degrees than men. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but anyway. So yeah, this idea was pushed. But because it was pushed in a neoliberal type of society, it got, again, like sort of reappropriated the wrong way, where it's like women now need to gain as much power as possible. It's not so much like entering the workforce, but it's like gaining power and becoming like men, which is something that is quite recurring in like girl boss type of books. So it's always this two, sort of the balance between you need to act like a man in order to rise and to become powerful, but at the same time you need to remain feminine. You need to, you know, think about having babies at some point. So it's always this sort of dilemma that kind of make it easy to transition back into this sort of conservative cancel culture where you have like the trad wife being like, no, this is not liberatory. What I do is liberatory. So everything is connected. And I guess with the girl boss, I see more and more criticism of the girl boss, and I feel like younger generations are becoming very, very skeptical of it. But at the same time, it's not because the figure, the aesthetic of the girl boss is disappearing that what the girl boss stands for, meaning gaining more and more power in a capitalist society, is dead. Like when you look at it, there are still Gen Z, millennial, female entrepreneurs. They're maybe they're more ethical in a way, like they I don't know, they take better care of their workers, and still like we're not 100% sure about that, but it's still very present. It's there. It hasn't disappeared. So I guess like the core issue there is like we haven't really questioned this notion of power. That essentially power is the thing that is wrong about this culture of domination. You know, like the neoliberal culture, where it's like you want to be on top, but like not everybody has their spots at the top of the hierarchy. So there is going to be some competition there. You're going to have to step onto other people, basically. So how do we, and maybe we weren't good enough to articulate that, or I don't know, maybe the whole culture of neoliberalism was better at integrating in pop culture, and that's why you have this image of the girl boss. So these are all questions that we can raise in when we wonder, when we kind of analyze like how this thing like the girl boss managed to gain so much power despite left-wing critique, despite what feminism truly stands for, which is solidarity, you know, like sorority, some would say. So yeah.
I wonder if this actually feeds a little bit into a positive side of the theme of collapse, because in a ways the power of the neoliberal dream was a kind of a subtraction of all the limits that you'd have in a sort of a relatively regimented, bureaucratic, quote unquote, sort of state welfare state. And with the sort of a rise of neoliberalism, and particularly sort of like the third way, I'm thinking of UK like Tony Blair, there was this narrative of social mobility because essentially as our economies in the West, and particularly in Europe and UK, transitioned to like a services economy, they needed those workers. And now those positions have kind of been filled and we're heading on the decline again. It almost feels like there's been a collapse of a narrative of social mobility, which kind of saps, in a very material sense, the power of the girl boss fantasy, because the girl boss, even for many women workers, is actually your boss now as well. And you're thrust back into that antagonism. I wonder what you think about that, whether there's actually a positive element of collapse here, in that we collapse our expectations or the ideological or the material foundation of these archetypes, these identities, as something totally crumbling.
I guess, yeah, as you mentioned, like it's funny to see like how progressively, the people who were once marginalized are now gaining power. So like what happens? Do we truly have an egalitarian society if the CEO is female, and if like we have 50% representation in parliament or things like that? Like these are questions that we need to ask ourselves, because progressively we're gonna get there. You know, it's gonna happen. And can we call that a victory? Of course it is. Of course it is. Representation is important, because when you see someone like you on screen, you are maybe more likely to want to, achieve the same thing or whatever. But is it enough? And I feel like maybe this is a moment where we can start to, like maybe like reappropriate this sort of narrative as leftists, as progressives, and like point a finger and say, you see, like they are there now, but things aren't changing. Like Hillary Clinton is such a good example of that. I mean, she didn't become president, but to go back to this notion of like essentializing, better female representation means we have a better society, which is so wrong in my opinion. It's not correlated. Hillary Clinton is a good example of that, because I would qualify her as some sort of a war criminal. She loves war. She loves going on war. She loves investing in war. Is it good? Is it what feminism stands for? Not really. So I guess that's why there is an opportunity there maybe to offer a new discourse and to show how the downfall of this archetype might be an opportunity for something different. But again, and I guess we'll have to talk about that later, but how do we make sure that this message that we have and that we've had for decades, to be honest, feminists have had for decades, how do we create a momentum around this message, because it's all about getting the attention of people, not just like screaming in a vacuum, like you got to be heard. So like, how do we attach that to something that has cultural meaning, like the girlboss had, like all those aesthetics I talk about in the book have. I guess that's the big issue.
Yeah, I think it's very good to center it around the problematic of representation, which always it leads us to question, who has power, who owns the means of representation, in a sense. And I remember in the book you quote Jonah Peretti, sort of the founder of BuzzFeed, who used to write some very Deleuze and Guattari inspired sort of French theory blogs, and it's. And then he decided to do that from the right instead of the left, and to have great success on his end. But I wanted to ask actually how the online frustrates this, particularly. I mean, with your experiences as an online, to use the term content creator. I know I hate
Content
using
creator.
it as well. Creator.
I guess that's what we'd use, to be honest, because like some people say influencer, and I'm like, I don't really like this term, so I would call myself a content creator, even though it doesn't really mean anything. But anyway. Yeah.
But I just wanted to ask how the online you think has frustrated this, particularly trying to get the message out there, because in a sense, you're fighting against the medium itself, sort of overwriting things, and also how this has been useful for the other side as well.
This is a very, very tough question. Something I think about quite a lot. How do we that's the question, right? Like, how do we play with what is now called the attention economy? Like, how do we give cultural value, or how do we create momentum around our message? It's kind of difficult because the online world is structured in a way where education is not always prioritized. What is prioritized, obviously, is sensationalism. Like, I'm not teaching anybody anything new. Some could argue that it has always been the case and it's not something new, a new feature of social media, but it's just like the way it is structured tends to emphasize that even more. So you'll have like the clickbait title, you have those quotes like that are used and then spread, etc. And to be more specific, in the case of the manosphere, for example, so this group of men online who are very open about their misogyny, sexism, etc. What they do is that they use the content, they turn it into a reel, they turn it into a TikTok video, then they use a podcast, clip a few things here and there, and that's how it works. They really understood how the attention economy works. Unfortunately, on the left, we kind of struggle with that because we value things like education, and educating people takes time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of nuance, understanding, and it's something that is difficult to do in a few sentences. It is something that is difficult to turn into something that is clickbait. I see some people doing it, which is great, but again, and that's something it's kind of an open question in my book, to be honest. Like, how can we not just be reactive? And by reactive, I mean taking what the other side says and does and then react to that and share our own version of the story. How can we be proactive? How can we create our own discourse, our own means of, you know, getting the attention of people, because it's not like limited to online politics. It's something I've noticed in regular electoral politics, business, as you I would say, but just politics in general, to be honest. The left at the moment, I feel, is too reactive. It's like the right will do something, the right will impose their ideas on the media, etc., and we go with it. And I guess one topic that kind of connects to the whole thesis ideas in the book, the way, for example, left-wing leaders deal with things like identity politics on TV, etc. Like identity politics have been used, and we've seen it recently with Rishi Sunak, who started to talk about gender and transgender people. And it's like, why is he bringing that up? And obviously, it makes so much sense. Like, they've been extremely bad at giving people what they need, basic needs, work. I mean, just being able to afford basic necessities. They've been really bad at giving that to people. So now they switch to what is quite consensual. Yeah, talking about transgender people in a very bad way, talking about feminism, or in France we have like this whole debate around like inclusive writing, which is like, and it works. It works so well. The media does it. They use those. It's not that they are not important issues, because obviously they are. But in terms of electoral politics, these are issues that do not, like if you talk about work, basically you get the attention of everybody. If you talk about transgender, I was going to say issues, but no, it's not an issue. The transgender question, even that term is not good. Transgender identity, let's say. Of course, like it's not going to be as less people will relate to it. So it's our job as leftists as well to kind of, I guess, reframe those questions and try to turn it to our own advantage. So, for example, like when we talk about identity politics, well, we talk most of the time about human rights, you know, like the right of people to emancipate and to live authentically. That's a notion I really enjoy, like this notion of living authentically. It connects to Simone de Beauvoir, you know, like the second sex. That was really like a big idea in her book, in her work. And that's something we continue to see, like in queer theory, etc. This idea of living authentically and being able to do so. So sorry, I went into like all directions because it's such an interesting question. And at the same time, like I don't have like a very specific answer to that, but maybe it will be another book. Who knows?
No, I mean it is such a there, especially in the UK. I mean, our country is mostly it has this weird relationship with its own press, because most of them tend to go to the same private schools. They tend to be owned by the aristocracy, which, unlike in France, we never properly dealt with. Let's say, and it's I mean, which is. Yeah, the way that issues around, I mean, what is termed, I'm not going to say the W word, but we all know what the W word is, you know, that when they say is, oh, this is just anti, you know, that. It's, when they talk about identity politics in UK press, it is entirely to set as they erect a debate in which exactly human rights, people's existence is put under question, fundamentally made into an object of debate, and then some people just take debate. And they think that they can somehow debate their way out of this by reacting to it, but in a way, reacting is to be cut off from what you can actually do. I mean, this is I guess been always my worry as someone who does a lot of sort of lefty sort of like theory stuff, is we try to avoid the debate format, because the debate format usually means two sides have a go at each other, and then everyone pats themselves on the back for how tolerant they've been and how lovely they've been. Like they've just been doing like a medieval medieval jousts weren't very safe, I guess. But something like, oh no, it's completely new in that case then. But yeah, I mean, leftist media, even in like the early days of what we could call breadtube, it was more or less, it was de-debunking industry. You were sent to these people, go get de-radicalized, go watch a 2-hour-long video. Exactly. And then go get de-radicalized. Don't get radicalized. Just get de-radicalized. It's fine. And then and then when it times comes to electoral things, we can't do anything right now. We need to go vote for the centrist sort of liberal, so the far right doesn't get in. And we've seen recently with the recent endorsements of genocide from all sort of centrist sort of liberal parties that it's not. But even so, we don't feel like we have the agency to keep going, because we've sort of leased our agency to post to some extent.
No, and like, I mean, going back to those TV interviews, etc., whenever I see a left-wing leader, I'm like, please do well, avoid, like, if they ask you questions about identity politics, etc., just do answer in a way that doesn't fall into the trap, you know, because the trap is always there. And I see it online as well. It's like, you'll say like one little thing, and in the comments you can see people like turning it into, oh, you said this, and that means you're like this, and it's like that, and it's like, no, just avoid the trap and turn it in a way that, again, like using those words, I like the term authenticity, human rights, again, like it's kind of difficult, I guess, especially now when we see like how those notions are pushed by some people sometimes, and then, you know, when they use it now, it's like kind of different. But anyway, we won't go into this, but there is work to do, like imposing our own agenda, imposing our own ideas in a media that clearly does not want to work in our favor. That is difficult, but I think we really, really need to do this, because at the moment, you know, like, for example, we have this notion of common sense that is beginning. I've seen Rishi Sunak use it as well. In France, we have more and more leftists trying to use this notion as well, kind of reclaiming this notion, but somehow it doesn't really work. And it's hard to explain why, but I feel like it has reached a point where this notion of common sense has become like so associated with the right or even the far right that we need to have something new. And I wish we spend more time trying to figure out a new way, a new vision, a new message, something that is positive, something that is anti-collapse as well, something that makes people want to believe in the future. And I know it's such a difficult task, and I don't have any answers, but it must be done. It must be done. Yeah.
The question of common sense, I mean, yeah, when a British political figure says common sense, I know something fascist is about to emerge from their tongue. But but it's weird when they say that, because they're also online. I mean, the newspapers, when they wrote about like student says this, it's mostly Twitter review, and there's an interesting sort of cottage industry of some leftists who have gone, you know, say, okay, I'm not like these leftists, they're all too online, and leftists they've got in their head is the one that the papers give them. And so they try to go out to ordinary people and say, I'm not online, I don't believe in X niche issue. And the normal people will say, what the hell is that? It's like they'll say, I'm not one of those Tumblr leftists, and they'll say, well, what's Tumblr? And their entire reaction to it has been their attempt to appear not weird makes them look weirder. And if anything, sort of embracing the particularities actually puts you closer to the average. There's no such thing, closer to actual people's concerns rather than reacting to the reaction.
Yeah, it makes me think of two things. It makes me think of how often I have this discussion. I don't do it now anymore because I've realized it's just how often I would, you know, talk with left-wing people, and at some point in the conversation, we would like do our little coming out as like, oh yeah, but you know, these leftists, I'm not like them, like, oh, they're bad, or blah, blah, blah. And it happened again and again. At some point I was like, but you know, there's people like, they're such a minority. And I think I can't remember the numbers exactly. I remember like seeing something like only 10% of Twitter users actually tweets. I don't know if that number is correct. Like, obviously, don't quote this. I don't have any source, but it did not surprise me, because I'm like, the online discourse is not regulated, but like produced by such a minority. And then, as you said, like people will pick up what has been said. It made me think of, when you say that, it made me think of this French guy who happens to be a boomer, but we won't reduce him to his age. But a right-wing guy. And he wrote an entire book called OK Millennials as a response to Twitter users who insulted him on Twitter. And it's absolutely amazing, because this guy managed to first get the generation wrong, because he was the people he was talking about were Gen Z, not millennials. So that was kind of funny. And then the second thing is that he did not interview any young person. So it was entirely based on like a few tweets that he saw. And like, this guy was invited on TV, he was invited on the radio. He kept talking about like how people back in the days, like it was specifically like in France in 1968, like we had a big wave of leftists like going in the streets, etc. Big left-wing movement. he was one of them, and he turned right-wing somehow. And so, yeah, he said, like, back in the days, we fought for equality, we were feminists, we were anti-racist, and blah, blah, blah. And now people are kind of, looking back on that time, being like, were you really feminist? Were you really anti-racist? Or what did it mean for you back then? And maybe it means something different for us now. And their reaction is like, no, that is wrong, blah, blah. Okay, millennials. And, and it's just really funny, like, how, again, like, as you said, like, how limited it is, and like how hyper-focused on online discourse it is. And again, like, online discourse is important because it does forge people's identities, people's opinions. But I guess there is a difference between online discourse and I guess like internet culture or trends, etc. And what I mean by that is that actually someone made me notice that recently, because they said, a patron on Discord, they said, Alice, I feel like your videos have kind of changed, like you're becoming more and more focused on online discourse rather than what happens online, and like what sort of thing, what we can, like how it impacts people. And I was like, I don't really understand what you mean there. And then he said, just look at your videos, like how they've evolved. And I was like, oh yeah, I see what you mean. Like, it is true that my last videos have been more and more directed at specific things or specific debates that would happen on Twitter, but won't necessarily be as relevant in real life. And I was like, yeah, maybe I am guilty of it. Maybe I'm doing it too. And it's interesting how easy we can get like caught up in those online discourses that, again, like in real life might not interest or impact that many people. I mean, the argument in my book is precisely that online culture, internet culture, etc., really forge people's identities and opinions, which I think is very true. But at the same time, there is a difference between that and online discourse. What I mean by online discourse is more like the little debates, or like the little thing that only happen on Twitter, but don't like actually impact a lot of people. But like, for example, like online discourse for me is different from something like the manosphere, which is an online thing as well. Like this thing, the manosphere, really, really has an impact on people. Like you can see it, whether it's like it completely influences young people into the way they think about women, etc., or to a lower degree, like just influencing like their idea of feminism, etc. I mean, it impacts people to various degrees. So I would say that this is the thing that I'm interested in. But it's so easy to fall into online discourse, which is more like the very specific debate culture type of things that most of the time aren't that relevant, I would say.
Absolutely. I was actually reading a book called Escape recently about the generation, sort of our generation that sort of grew up with the internet. And one of the things that was so enlightening I read about it was, it's actually not an echo chamber. That's the thing. It's not an echo chamber. That's the problem with it, because if it was an enclosed space where people could debate on Twitter or YouTube or something, we could have these debates internal to sort of affinity groups and communities, and then they could work themselves out from their sort of most wild beginnings. Whereas now everyone can see each other at any point. So one is, having these debates about, for example, sort of the nuances of queer theory in public, where any reactionary or newspaper columnist or something can see it. And it's the overexposure which both accelerates it and creates, the capital D, capital T, capital D discourse. And I guess moving on a little, well, not moving on, but tangentially from the online aspect, is one of the sort of fermenting kinds of reaction that you chronicle really well is this projection of precisely one of the key things of May 68. I mean, May 68, I can't remember the French, but in English that you've translated, there's a really good graffiti which said "Read, write, and act accordingly" on a few of the student protests. And of course, he wrote the sexual revolution. So to ask about this rejection, the sexual revolution, I guess first we can start with, like, what was the sexual revolution? What is its sort of cultural legacy, and sort of where is the turn away from it that you've observed in the book?
Yeah, so some scholars, that's something I realized when I started researching more into it. Like some scholars say, no, it did not start in the 1960s. It started sooner. It's been it's always like those little debates among scholars, and it's like, let's say it started in the 1960s, or like at least it's accelerated in the 1960s. And basically the demand centered on greater access to I mean, healthcare for women, for example, like just better understanding women's bodies, getting greater access to abortion, to contraception, better educating people on sexuality as well. And then you also had gay liberation movements who were more interested in, normalizing homosexuality, legalizing in some aspects homosexuality, ending the stigma around non-traditional relationships as well. So these were kind of the ideals of the sexual revolution. But again, it emerged at a time where capitalism was becoming more and more prevalent in people's lives. Neoliberalism was slowly rising. So again, it's another instances where sexual revolution, sexual liberation was kind of corrupted by neoliberalism and turned into something that was kind of devoid of politics in a way. It became sort of aesthetic, and that's something we really, really clearly see now. I mean, when you look at music videos, hypersexual music videos, they're called. Again, this notion of power. It's not so much about being sexually liberated, even though the lyrics, the image shows sexual liberation. It's more about like, how can I use that to gain power, to and it's very centered around like consumption, like having the right clothes, performing the right, being cool, which means like, again, like having the right clothes, the accessories, etc. So again, it's one of those things where it feels like we are sexually liberated. It feels like because you go to college and you can have sex with as many people as you want, and it's even defined as something that is cool, like hookup culture, things like that. But again, like when you look at it, a lot of people who engage in those hookup culture type of thing, etc., go back to a more traditional norm when they leave college, and sometimes they are the ones who will criticize other people for being sexually liberated. So I always find it quite funny, quite interesting to see that, like how people behave during certain times of their lives, but then once that cool time of their life is over, it's like they go back to more traditional norms. And it says a lot about how sexual liberation, sexual revolution is perceived in our culture. It's something we do to empower ourselves, but in a very, I want to become powerful, I want to feel important type of way. And that is not exactly what early sexual liberation movements, 1960s movements, gay liberation movements really stood for. That's not exactly it. And just to show a counterexample to that, I think a lot of feminists, a lot of queer theorists have pointed at this notion of desire. Like, how come do we live in a society where it feels like we're sexually liberated, but things like desire, what people truly want, a lack of desire as well. Like some people just don't want to be hypersexual, and we're starting to have those conversations, but it's only happening in feminist circles. The usual script is, you need to have sex, and the woman needs to submit, and the man needs to be powerful, and blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, but like it started in the 1960s. Like, why are we did not update that, and it's okay. It's not about kink shaming or anything. Like, we all have our taste in everything, but it's about questioning is it truly what we want? And how do we know what we want when we've only been given one script? If you see what I mean, like, how are we really sexually liberated? And many said no. I mean, Foucault is one of them. He said that he said that very early on. And I think like his analysis of the state of sexual liberation and the discourse around sexual liberation back then is still relevant today. It's very, very centered around this notion of transgression. So you go to college, you have a bunch of sexual experiences, and it's transgressive. But after college, you just go back to the norm. You marry, you have kids, and then you are the person slut-shaming, you are the person like criticizing those teenage girls for dressing the way they do. And I find it fascinating. And for me, it's very, very revealing of the fact that we haven't gone deep enough in this concept of like sexual liberation.
No, I totally agree. Even thinking about, as you said, some of the gay liberation fronts in France in the 60s, people like, Guy Ockenham and the FHAR. And as you say, that the reducing it to a dialectic of transgression is kind of, you think you've escaped and then it's sitting there at the end, because you can transgress the limit, you can transgress the sexual norm or prohibition only on the basis that you maintain that sexual norm and prohibition so you can transgress it. And it's a
Exactly.
very
Exactly.
interesting view of desire that presupposes, because otherwise, I mean, what is the view of desire there? Is it a view, okay, you can desire whatever you want, you can do whatever you desire, you just can't desire whatever you desire. But what you desire has to come from sort of a pre-approval list, which is already established by the things which are repressing or producing desire. And it is this. And one could definitely see in this a kind of a parallel to the economic transformation too, because you think about the sort of capitalism they were revolting against in '68. The sort of the Fordist, you clock in every day, it's highly regimented. The man goes home to like a nuclear family, ideally, as Ford put it, and everyone says, "Fuck that, we don't want this anymore." And then neoliberalism just about to come around the corner and say, "Good news, you're not doing this anymore." Everyone goes, "Great," and here we
It's
are.
exactly that. Yeah. No, it's so true, and it's great that you mentioned that, because I was gonna do it. Like, I was gonna connect it back to the image of the girl boss, which is like projected as a sort of revolution for women in the workforce. And when you think about it, like, what is truly revolutionary about it? The girl boss is still part of the 1%. She is still expected to do the same thing as the boy boss, if we have to call it like that. So things haven't changed much. The same people are still in power. Maybe there's a little bit more diversity up there. Maybe representation is a little bit better, but the system hasn't changed, and we still have the same people at the bottom. Women are more likely to be in very low-paying job, etc. So like, we don't, as a society, we don't move forward. Like, it's there's nothing truly revolutionary, truly transformative about this. It's this sort of aesthetic that we project and that we promote so much, because we love to do, like, to have a female face as CEO, but like deep down, like, what's behind the sort of this image, this aesthetic, and it's not always pretty.
Everyone can be represented, but very few can be able to present themselves, in a sense, because it's you can be presented with these universal images of polished advertising, but nonetheless access. Only one person get in front of the camera, and there is incredible amounts of striation, sort of passcodes, hidden rules of thousands, centuries of history which maintain how they get into there. And so it almost seems like the problematic is do we stay with, do we work within this, or do we sort of detach, delink, and try to sort of find I mean, there's definitely this in French political thought tradition of this. I mean, we've still got the Zads, I think, in a few of them in the countryside, but it very much is this question of, do we stick with the institutions, or do we try to create like some kind of barrier around it where we can sort of cultivate something and then sort of release it back into the circuits?
No, it's interesting. Like, last week, was it last week? Yeah. I was invited to the European Parliament because the Committee on Women's Rights are working on a directive that is meant to create a European standard in terms of sexual violence, rape, etc., just to make sure that every country has more or less the same type of laws, etc. And they're really struggling with it, especially because they are facing the conservative backlash that I'm talking about in the book. And they're very frustrated. And so we were invited to talk with the MEPs who are kind of pushing for this directive. Both of them are women, not surprising. And one of the girls I was with, the first thing she said, I was like, "Gosh, you're bold. Like, that's the first question you ask. Good job." The first thing she said was like, "I come here, but like, I don't know if it's a good thing, because I don't know if we need to work within those structures. I don't know if my role is to come to the parliament and talk to you and like listen to what you have to say, or I wonder if my job is not whether to act outside of that structure and kind of really like remove that structure, basically, get rid of it, dismantle it, abolish it, whatever you want to call it." And I thought it was brave of her to say that immediately, because when we are invited in those structures as well, it's kind of hard to have this sort of discourse, because like after she asked that question and we were both looking, not both, like all of us were looking at each other being like, she's kind of right, and we all deeply know it. And that's why I find it so frustrating, because we we know it. We know it doesn't work. But we keep trying at it. We keep hoping that it will change. But even with that directive in particular, it's like the way they have to change the language, remove stuff from it, it ends up being something that doesn't have any. I mean, it will be relevant if it passes, and it would be a good thing, I assume. But like it is very frustrating. But at the same time, as you said, like, so in France we have ZAD, zone à défendre, so areas to defend, I guess we can translate it like that, which are they run in a very independent way. A new one was created recently because they want to create a new highway in the south of France. But again, it's like, how do those people gain, they can become movements, basically, because they're very certain, they operate in a way that is very specific to them, and it's amazing what they do, because like they have presented stuff and prevented a lot of infrastructures to be built in the past. We have an airport somewhere else in France, so it is effective. But at the same time, like, how do we build a greater momentum around those movements, and how do we capitalize on those movements to then, gain power in other spheres, gain power with electoral politics? And deep down, like, do we actually need that? Like, it's these are questions that, again, are kind of difficult, because, and part of my work is also like dealing with those questions as well, because like I'm technically part of the structure. Like, I make videos on YouTube. I do rely on sponsors to, earn a living, basically. So am I also part of the problem? Am I also taking part in an industry that is bad and that forces me to, get that clickbait content and like promote this sort of sensationalist way of consuming information or educating oneself? It's kind of difficult. I have no answers to that, and like, so yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. When I think about it for too long, I'm like, I get depressed, and then but yeah.
Yeah, as a member of the scourge of leftism, which is podcasting, I completely feel the worries about complicity all the time. It's like, because you're a content creator, that means you technically work for the platforms, but you could,
exactly, yeah.
There's always some soft subversions of guitarists that we can do it. But in terms of mixing, actually, the kind of the delinking aspects with the being in the middle of things, being in the metropole, I really want to talk to you about your studies on the Black Panthers, because that is a good kind of fusion, because they're providing these systems of healthcare, they're providing community lunches, they're providing community self-defense, but they're not sort of retreating to the countryside in this sort of very sort of Maoist move for example, the ZADs would put together. Yeah, I want to ask particularly, sort of, I know you've done some research on this before. What your research has been into the Black Panthers, and how that has informed the wider scope of not just a book, but how you approach certain issues today around community organizing. As you say, it's self-health rather than self-care. I'm really interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, totally. So I started my research on not necessarily the Black Panther Party, but I was really, really interested in the transition from the civil rights movement to the Black Panther Party. And one thing that is very interesting and specific about these two movements, because they're quite separate, is how close they are to one another. We're talking about a year, 2 years maximum between the end of the first one. Like, some would say like there's some overlap, which is very rare, because like usually when you have a crisis, then you have disruption, like you had the civil rights movement, but then things go back to normal, and it takes a little while before people get upset again and you have another crisis. Like, but anyway, my point is that I wanted to kind of look at how this movement emerged, and the fact that it was urban was very decisive, because like, this is where the working class was, and the working class did not benefit from the civil rights movement. They did not, because again, it was the victories of the civil rights movement were very much based. They were still very limited to the system that existed. So again, like representation, things like that, and you could really see it in urban spaces, because those who gained power were the black elite, as it was called. So lawyers, doctors, black lawyers, black doctors, but the black working class did not gain any power. And so that's why you have a movement like the Black Panther Party. It was a response to that. So that was kind of like how I started. And then I looked at the Black Panther Party more, and like how they organized and how they created a city within a city, which is fascinating because, as you said, like it's the same system as Z, but it's very much like in the city. So of course they faced way more police brutality, police violence because of that, because they tried to organize within the city. And but yeah, like it was fascinating. So they had a bunch of people's programs, free food, breakfast programs for kids. What else did they have? The free clinics, obviously, that's the one I worked on the most. So they really, to connect again to this notion of care, they really appropriated care in a way that is, that really, how can I say this? I guess not in the neoliberal way, but obviously that makes total sense. But you know, like one aspect of care is that we have this image of care as something that is cute, pretty, yeah, we're taking care of each other, like holding hands, solidarity, etc. But the Black Panther Party like kind of challenged this notion because they were carrying weapons, you know, like they were quite brutal, and there was a lot of fights with the police, etc. So it's like, it looks like it was not about care. It looks like it was about violence, etc. That's how they were portrayed on the media. But then behind this image of like the defense movement, because that's what they were called, like the full name is the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. So that's how I started to think about this notion of self-health, because it connects, obviously. And so again, yeah, so you have this sort of image of like self-defense, weapons, etc. But in the back, like they were doing all this care work, all this, trying to build a community around this notion of care, around this notion of reappropriating what it means to take care of the self. And that's really something that I wanted to highlight in the book. The fact that you can be left-wing and care about the self, you know, like caring about the self doesn't have to be a neoliberal quality, because that's how it's been sold to us. It's, you know, it's like, taking care of the self has become like taking care of your brand. And it doesn't have to be like that. And the Black Panthers are such a good example of that. They use care in a way that made them more resistant to external, like, to oppression, basically, to police brutality, etc. Their ideal was to, have a revolution. So there was also this goal in mind of like making sure that individuals can take care of themselves, develop strong bodies so that they are ready for revolution. And I really like this idea, and I really like the fact that they are such a good example that, again, self-care doesn't have to mean, selfishness, like something like, I would say, something like that, something that is what a neoliberal society, sell us, I would say.
Absolutely. I mean, it particularly feels incredibly relevant in the idea of self-health, particularly the delinking from traditional healthcare systems, especially when they're incredibly, they put barriers to access, particularly in the trans struggle today with DRI, sort of HRT movements, even sort of struggles against opioid addiction in states with people carrying Narcan just as a regular thing. I mean, and of course, even in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, with the reason why they're, airstrikes are targeting paramedics and hospitals, is because if you destroy the community ability to have shelter in those caring spaces, it is. I mean, yeah, we can see sort of in the negative by who these systems target, where the real choke points are, which is, of course, why the online debates about moving into a debate sphere is so frustrating. You can see where the forces of opposition are actually targeting, so therefore you can abstract from that. So no, I think it's an incredibly relevant piece. I think I'm really glad I was incredibly pleased to read that stuff in there, especially this idea of self health. I would love to see it, definitely. And I'd love to see like a few books on it, to be honest. That's the kind of concept I think we needed, because otherwise self-care tends to, exactly, it's about a brand, in the sense of one sees the self as something you cultivate as a product, rather than the self as the process of becoming yourself, or becoming something that takes care of itself. And then that is only possible within a certain kind of, communal framework, which brings the whole question of community, rather than cutting it off from the self, absolutely brings it into a sharp framework. And I think, particularly in the way you highlight the Black Panthers, really brings that to the center in like a really refreshing way.
No, it's true. And like, so we're talking about the Black Panthers, but this tradition of self-help is very old, very, very old in the black community. In the book, I also talk about Du Bois, a great Black thinker who, like he wrote about the gospel of the. Oh, so which one was it for him? Because there was the gospel of the toothbrush. I think it was the toothbrush for Du Bois. And when we say that, it sounds like he was kind of looking down on Black people, being like, you need to brush your teeth. But, like hygiene was a big problem back then. So it was quite relevant. It was just not just a Black people's problem, obviously. It was just a general problem. So, but it was not just about brushing your teeth. It was about so much more than that. And he made sure that Black people understood it as well. It's like taking care of yourself makes you feel better about yourself. It makes you feel stronger. And therefore it makes you... there was always this consciousness of you're not just doing it for yourself. You're doing it for the Black race. You're doing it for the community. You're doing it to uplift the race, to move forward. Obviously, we could criticize some of the things he said, or like his vision that could be a bit elitist in some aspects. I guess the Black Panther Party really focused on the... was kind of different in that sense. It was very much focused on it was way more Marxist, way more taking the individual as it is, and like not imposing like a sort of you need to be the top, because there was this notion of the top tens. I can't remember exactly with Du Bois. So there was still like some elitist undertones that the Black Panther Party did not necessarily have. But still, and it connects to what Foucault talked about as well, with the development of the self, the technique of the selves, with that if you look at them in our current society, you would think he's talking about like, taking care of yourself, etc. Like he's talking in a positive way. And I think like it has become a bit of a weakness on the left. It's like we're so scared to fall into the self-help, self-care discourse that we refuse to talk about the self. And we assume that discussions on the self will automatically mean that we're falling for that neoliberal discourse. But it's a shame, because like you need to know yourself to be able to be a good social justice advocate, to be a good activist, or just to be a good person and to be a good citizen, And that was an argument that Foucault put forward. It's like this idea that, again, like taking care of yourself physically or psychologically is good not just for you. It's good for the community. It's good for the people you're going to interact with. And but again, it goes back to this idea that we have a duty as a citizen to do this and that. I do believe it. I do believe that we have the duty to, educate ourselves, to make sure that we are conscious citizens, aware, especially right now with what is going on. Like I feel like it is a duty to, educate yourself. And that's something that Foucault highlighted. That's something that others have highlighted as well. And I think that's something we need to reclaim as leftists as well. As you said, like seeing the self as a process, and then the angle not being just the self, but like us as part of a community. The sort of, I remember someone saying like promoting singularity within the community. And again, like someone like Simone de Beauvoir is such a good example of that. Like existentialism as a philosophy is very much about this sort of this quest of authenticity, this quest of developing the self, understanding the self, prioritizing the self as well, but in a way that also is outward, oriented towards the outward, I would say. Something that is not just about you, something that can be beneficial to others as well.
And on that note, it's a beautiful way to round things off. Alice, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Now, folks, the book comes out on November the 14th, but after that, if you want to pick up the book, Alice is actually doing a UK tour. And I'll just list, then it's about 5 different dates. Well, no, sorry, the UK and Ireland. So we have 12th of November. at the Radical Book Fair in Edinburgh. Alice will be there promoting Collapsed Feminism, as well on the 16th of November at Inc. at 84 in London. Then it'll be on the 21st with Ryan Donnelly at the Feminist Bookshop in Brighton, 22nd of November at the illustrious Toppings Bookstore in Bath, and then rounding off at the 29th by finally escaping the cursed island known as Britain and going to the Winding Stairs in Dublin.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.